Welcome to the first step of building your photo formula, composition and styling. Unlike some courses where they dive right into camera settings, we're starting with composition and styling because they're the first steps in every photo shoot. The objects you choose and where you place them affect how you light your scene, how you shoot it, and how you edit. So it only makes sense to start here. So let's dive in. Before we start composing a scene, it's important to have a foundation. Without a foundation or an understanding of our preferences, we're just placing objects on a surface and hoping it turns out pretty. To start, I find it helpful to think of composition and styling as two different things. Composition is broader than styling. It's the framework that determines where you'll place everything and what areas you'll leave bare. The goal of composition is to first draw your viewer in, then guide their eyes around the scene to land on the most important elements of your photo. Styling, on the other hand, is more specific. It's the objects you place into that framework and how you orient them. It's also the creative additions, like a sprinkle of crumbs in the foreground, that add visual interest and fill the space. To put it in the context of a home, composition is the architecture and styling is the decor. In this lesson, we're introducing 5 composition concepts we'll be using to compose and style our scenes in the next lesson. The goal of these concepts isn't to tell you 5 rules to follow. It's for you to discover your preferences when it comes to each concept, so that you can apply that set of preferences when you start composing. This will make you faster at composing, and it'll make your choices more intentional. The 5 concepts are lines, the rule of odds, negative space, cropping for mystery, and visual interest. As I compose every scene, I run through these 5 concepts and consider which ones to use. Since I'm a massive fan of acronyms as a memory device, I remember them using LRNCRV, or Learn Curve. I love this acronym because it's so accurate. Everything in photography is a learning curve at first. By using this acronym to help me remember each concept as I compose, if I decide not to use a concept in a photo, I know I did it intentionally, rather than because I forgot about it. The first concept to consider is lines. Lines add structure to your scene and guide your viewer's eyes around it. We experience 2 types of lines when we look at a photo: actual lines and implied lines. Actual lines are clear and visible within the composition. Actual lines are more common in landscape and portrait photography, in which we often see the horizon line or the edges of a road as it winds into the distance. We occasionally see actual lines in surface-based photography, thanks to rectangular props like this one, or the prominent edge of a plate. However, in surface-based photography, we're usually creating implied lines based on prop positioning and where we leave empty space. Lines can be both straight and curved. Here's an example of an implied diagonal line we created by lining the props from corner to corner. And here's another example using products rather than food. Contrast that with this photo, where we placed the subject in the center and didn't add extra props to create a line. There's nothing wrong with it, but the addition of the line really fills out the flat lay scene. You can also include multiple lines in one scene. Here's an example of multiple implied diagonal lines created by leaving some space between each row of props. Alternatively, we can place props in opposite corners, leaving the middle area empty like we did here. Because the eye is so used to seeing lines in nature, we feel a diagonal line even though there's a gap. Lines don't have to be straight either. We can create a curved line like in this example. Notice how the props form a C shape with empty space in the center. We'll talk about how to create a C-shaped composition later on, and we'll take it step by step. And by the way, lines aren't just for flat lay photos. The most effective eye-level photos also use implied lines, particularly a single diagonal line from one back corner to the opposite front corner. We'll also talk about how to create this composition in the next lesson. The second concept is the rule of odds. This rule states that when you're photographing a group of subjects, for example, multiple bowls of soup rather than just one, an odd number of subjects will produce a more visually appealing composition. The most common use of this rule is using either 3 or 5 subjects rather than 2 or 4. In this example, there are 3 plates of food forming the body of a C-shaped composition. Contrast that with this similar photo where there are 2 subjects. And with this photo, where there are either 2 subjects, the 2 soups, or 4 subjects, if you include the side salads as subjects. Either way, there's an even number of objects, which just isn't quite as visually appealing to some people. One thing to note is that this rule breaks down when the number of subjects gets too high to recognize without counting. For me, this is anything higher than 5 subjects. When you're including 6 or more subjects, like we did in this baking ingredient photo, the viewer's eyes can't immediately tell if it's an odd or an even number, so you can really just use as many objects as you want. The same goes for this photo we looked at earlier. I have no idea how many items are here. All I see is abundance. So now that you know that this concept exists, you get to decide if you agree with it and decide how many subjects you prefer. Think of it as the principle of odds or the suggestion of odds rather than a hard and fast rule. The photos we just looked at lead us right into the next principle, negative space. Negative space is the space around and between the subject or subjects of a photo. In art, negative space is often an actual shape that shares edges with the subject. This image is the classic example of negative space. Depending on how you look at it, it's either a goblet or 2 faces. In surface-based photography, the definition is a little more flexible. I like to think of negative space as the space you leave empty on purpose, rather than space that just happens to be empty after you're done placing your props. To make that more clear, let's look at the candle photo again. You can see that we purposely left the center of the C empty. This empty space is vital to creating a C composition. Same thing with the flat lay diagonal composition. The corners are left empty on purpose to create the diagonal line of subject and props. Contrast these with this hummus photo. There's empty space at the top and bottom, but we aren't being intentional with that space. The space is empty because we placed our subject and props in the center and we ended up with the space. And that's not a bad thing. It's just the difference between a photo that uses negative space and one that doesn't. Next up is the concept of cropping for mystery. This is a classic artistic concept that lends itself perfectly to surface photography. The goal here is to make sure that one or more of your props is cropped off so you can't see the whole thing. This implies that the actual scene is more expansive than the viewer can see and makes the viewer want to peek around the edge to see more. For food photos, it implies that there are more guests at the party and it invites the viewer to join. To really see the difference, here's an example with everything included in the field of view. Compare that with the same scene cropped for mystery. And here's an eye-level example. Cropping for mystery can either be done by excluding parts of objects from the camera's field of view when you're taking the photo, or by cropping a photo while editing. So we both agree it's better to crop something off, but how much? There's no hard and fast rule for this, but cropping half or more of an object can feel unbalanced. And to my eye, anything less than 1/4 off feels accidental rather than purposeful. So my optimal crop is somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 cropped off so that you can see 3/4 to 2/3 of the object. When you compose your own scenes, try cropping to different degrees and see if you agree that cropping 1/4 to 1/3 off is most appealing. One exception to this, however, is when you don't really have a specific subject and you just want to show an abundance of objects. Another exception is when your eyes disagree with mine. So try different crops and see which ones you like. Finally, let's talk about visual interest. Here at Replica, we use the term visual interest constantly, but what does that mean to have it in your photos? To us, visual interest can either be something that consciously catches the eye, like using a bed of textured pebbles to display a pair of earrings, or it can be something that isn't noticed consciously but fills out the scene and makes the photo more satisfying to the viewer. One example is this sprinkling of pepper flakes, chickpeas, and crumbs in the hummus photo. Other examples are the vase and pumpkins in the background of this eye-level photo. These additions aren't the star, but they're important supporting characters that fill out the scene and satisfy the eye. We'll talk about specific ways to add visual interest to both food and product photos in the styling tools and techniques lessons. And there they are, the 5 concepts I always keep in mind whether I decide to use them in every photo or not. So let's summarize our learn curve with one photo. Lines guide your eyes around the photo. They can be straight or curved, single or multiple. The rule of odds states that odd numbers of subjects can be more visually appealing than even numbers. If your eye agrees, consider 3 or 5 subjects. Negative space is the space you leave empty on purpose. It can prevent photos from looking cluttered. Cropping objects makes a scene feel expansive. Add visual interest through texture and sprinkling. Consider textured linens and sprinkling multiple different textures in one photo for added color and texture. So now it's your turn. Open your workbook and discover your preferences when it comes to the learn curve concepts. Your main action items are: do an inspiration search and save photos that contain the learn curve concepts. Look at blogs, Instagram pages, websites, or anything else of people or companies that photograph a similar subject as you. Compose and photograph scenes featuring variations on the learn curve concepts. Include different types of implied line, numbers of objects, amounts and locations of negative space, crops, and visually interesting items. Doing this will make your formula for composition and styling start to take form. Definitely follow along in the workbook for more detail and advice on each of these action items.